the honor to talk with Dr. JP Moreland, distinguished professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology, author and co-author of 35 books and counting, published more than 200 magazine and journal articles. Dr. Moreland became a friend of the Romanian ministry last year when he was part of the first Zoom conference in Sibiu during the pandemic, when Romanian had to be home by 8 p.m. for overnight quarantine. But a group of young people had the opportunity to question Dr. Moreland on arguments for the existence of God. Over 200 were gathered in the sanctuary of Bethania Baptist Church in Sibiu, all eager to have a dialogue with the reputable apologist, Dr. Moreland. Dr. Moreland, thank you for your support and help in the apologetics effort in Romania, and welcome to this program.
I'm honored to be here and looking forward to it.
Today, the reason I invite you, Dr. Moreland, because I want to discuss the topic of the soul. I have 3 books on this topic written by you. Love your God with all your mind, the Hidden Triangle, Recover the Christian Mind, Renovate the Soul, Restore the Spirit Power, and the soul, how we know it's real and why it matters. This will help me to navigate through this challenging subject, I may say. Metaphysical naturalists do not believe in soul or spirit nor ghost, and when explaining what constitutes the mind, they rarely appeal to the substance dualism. Instead, metaphysical naturalism told that intelligence is the refinement and improvement of naturally involved faculties. On the other hand, the Bible teaches about the consciousness and the soul. Many verses talks specifically about consciousness, and about 432 verses talks about the soul in the 40 books of the Bible. Can you please explain the difference and the properties of each entities?
I certainly can. So the brain is a material object. It is a physical object, and it has physical properties. That means it has properties like having a certain mass, it has a certain size and shape, it has certain electrical activity that's going on inside of it, and it is composed of chemicals. Now, the soul is something that contains consciousness and animates the body. So what is a soul? Well, a soul is a substance. It's a thing. By a substance, I mean something that has attributes and that can remain the same over time, even though certain features might change. And so you can, if you want to talk about the soul as a substance, you can talk about it as the I or the ego or the self. All those are the same. And for the substance dualism, the properties of consciousness are in no way physical, and it is the soul that has the properties of consciousness, not the brain. And so what would be examples of properties of consciousness? Well, when you introspect and pay attention to your own conscious life, you discover 5 different kinds of events that occur inside of us. There will, first of all, be sensations. You might have a sensation of pain. You might have a sensation of a red object, and you're aware of its color, or awareness of a sound. So those would be having a sensation. The next would be having a thought. And a thought is a content that can be true or false, and that can be expressed in a sentence. So different languages could express the same mental content. For example, Schnee ist weiß and snow is white are two completely different sentences, but they both express the content that can be in your mind as a thought that snow is white. And so beliefs are mental contents that you believe to be true. There are thoughts that you don't believe, and there are beliefs that you're not thinking about right now. Like I have a whole bunch of beliefs about the multiplication tables, but I'm not thinking about them right now, Octavian. I'm thinking about you and our question, our time. There are also the properties of being a desire for ice cream, or a desire for God, or a desire to be good at my job. And then finally, there is the property of having free will, or the power to act freely and not be determined. And so these would be the kinds of properties that are contained in the soul. They're not in the brain. And the brain is a material object. The soul is a spiritual object, a self that has conscious properties and makes your body alive and animates your body.
In 2011, at the meeting of Society of Christian Philosophers, N.T. Wright offered 4 reasons for rejecting the existence of the soul. Yes. Even though throughout the history, the ecumenical Christian tradition, including Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and most historic Protestant churches, had affirmed that God created humans as a unity of body and soul.
Yes.
Why do biblical scholars reject substance dualism, since it seems that we have abundant evidence of it in the scriptures?
Yes, I have an answer to that. And I'll just explicitly state it about N.T. Wright's paper. Prior to him giving the paper you're talking about, he had written a whole host of books defending the fact that when we die, our self or our person or the immaterial part of us continues to exist in an intermediate state between death and final resurrection. And he called it life after death. And what he meant by that is you die, then there's life after death without a body. In an intermediate state, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And then eventually there will be life after that, life after death. And that will be when Christ comes back and we all get our resurrected bodies. So very clearly, Wright has defended, and in that very paper you're citing, he defends that, when Paul says, I don't know if I was in my body or not, when I went up and heard things that no man's allowed to share. Well, Paul was obviously assuming that he could leave his body. And if that's true, he couldn't be his body, could he? So Wright argues that, but here was his problem. And here is I have debated New Testament scholars on this point. And Octavian, what their problem is this: they equate substance dualism, which is a belief in a spiritual soul that's not physical and it's different from the body. They equate that with Plato's dualism. And they think that Plato's dualism is the same thing as substance dualism. So if you look at Wright, he says, well, the reason substance dualism is wrong is, first of all, it teaches that the body's evil and that physical work isn't as important as intellectual work. Secondly, it teaches that the soul will exist forever without any need for God or anyone to sustain it. It exists on its own. And the soul, if you believe in the soul, you demean the nature of our physical body. And he says, none of that is biblical. Well, I agree with him, but that is only criticizing one form of substance dualism. I don't accept Plato's version of dualism, but there are today 5 or 6 different forms of substance dualism. None of them are Platonic dualism. And the New Testament scholars have just not done their homework. And they need to talk to Christian philosophers so they don't make that. That's kind of an undergraduate mistake, to be honest with you. I have great respect for N.T. Wright when he's in his field, but when he moves into my field, he kind of embarrasses himself a little bit. So the reason they're rejecting the soul is because they think that if you're a dualist and you believe in the soul, then you're a Platonic. That's the only version is Plato's. And they rightly reject that, but they don't understand there are plenty left that capture what the Bible is teaching us.
Thank you so much for that clarification, because that makes a huge difference in understanding the whole concept. The attention schema theory, AST for short, which was developed, a few years ago, suggested that consciousness arises as a solution to one of the most fundamental problems facing any nervous system. Too much information constantly flow into be fully processed. AST suggests that consciousness is the ultimate result of that evolutionary sequence. Can you explain the nature of consciousness?
Absolutely, I can. Suppose that you had an operation. The doctor anesthetized you, put you asleep, and you're in the recovery room. And all of a sudden, you begin to feel a throb in your foot, and you start feeling it hurts a little bit. And then you have the thought, I think I'm at home right now, but I'm not sure. And then you all of a sudden you form the belief, oh my, I believe that I was just operated on. I forgot all about that. And then you begin to have a feeling of thirst and a desire to get some water. And you choose to, because your eyes are still closed, and you choose to say, if there's anyone in the room, would you please bring me something to drink? Now, what's happening is you're regaining consciousness. And consciousness is like that. Now, I can give you 3 features of consciousness if it will help. Consciousness is, first of all, it always belongs to a subject. You don't have sensations or feelings or thoughts floating around by themselves. A thought or a feeling is always someone's. So conscious states and experiences are always belong to a subject that has them. But that's not true of any brain event or any physical state or object. It doesn't belong to any subject. So what's happening in my brain doesn't belong to a subject. It's just what's happening in this chunk of matter. That's all. Secondly, for any conscious state, there is what it is like to be in that state. Let me illustrate. There is a what it is like to be in pain. And we know what that's like. That's different than what it's like to tasting raspberries. That's different than what it's like to be thinking about World War II. And that's different than what it's like to desire a lunch or to desire to be a godly father. Those are all different. So a conscious state is defined by the unique what it is like to be in that state. But that isn't true of any physical thing. There's no what it's like to be an electron. There's no what it's like to be a computer. A computer doesn't know it's a computer. There's no what it's like to be for water to turn into ice and what it's like to be frozen. There's no what it's like to have mass. And so consciousness has a property, it's unique what it's like, or experiential texture, that no physical state of the brain has. So consciousness can't be a state of the brain. They're different. Finally, conscious states have what philosophers call intentionality. And that means they're of or about things. So I might have a sensation of the lamp, I might have a thought about Romania. I might have a desire about ice cream. I may have a belief about mountains. So when we have conscious states, they're of objects of those states, London, ice cream, whatever it might be. But when you study a physics or chemistry or a neuroscience textbook, and they're describing what matter is in physics and chemistry, and they're describing what a neuron is and what happens when they electrically spark a little gap in there, you will not find any scientist attributing ofness to a chunk of matter. Any brain state you're in is not of anything. It's not about something. It just is there. It's just sitting there, maybe electrically firing. So those are three characteristics of consciousness. A conscious episode has its own what it's like. It always will belong to a subject, and it is always of or about something, but that's not true of anything physical. Now, one other thing that might interest you. This is a fourth characteristic of consciousness that shows it's not physical. We have private access to our own conscious states. Now, what that means is this. There are certain ways that you can tell what's going on inside my conscious life. Namely, if I get stuck with a pen and I start shouting and grimacing, you'll probably say that between me getting stuck and my rubbing my knee, and I'm feeling pain. And that would be a reasonable thing for you to think. Or if I verbally report, I don't like it in here, then you will probably say, well, he has the thought in his mind that he doesn't like it in here, and he expressed it in language. Now, but see, you don't have, though I have that way of knowing your conscious states too, but I have a way of knowing my states that's not open to you. And that is from first person introspective awareness. I can simply introspect inside of me, and I'm aware of what's going on in there. And you can't do that to my states. You can introspect yours. No one else except me can introspect mine. So what that means is, Octavian, I have private access or a way of being aware of my conscious life that's not true of anybody else. Now contrast that with any state of a physical object. Suppose a statue is in the state of being hot, or suppose the brain is in a state of having a lot of electrical activity. Suppose maybe in this part of the brain, it's kind of deprived of the oxygen it needs. Any physical object or property or state that's physical, we all have equal public access to it. Every way you have of knowing about that physical property or state, if I've learned and done my homework, I can know about it in the same way. So what you see is that physical properties and physical objects like a rock, or a physical state like being cold or having a certain mass, they're publicly accessible. Everybody can know about them equally. But mental conscious states are not publicly accessible. They're only accessible by the person who has them. That's why I can hide from you and not tell you what's going on inside of you, or I can fake it. And there's no way you can tell that I'm faking it unless I tell the truth. Well, if my consciousness were just physical states of my brain, well, then I would have no private access to them because they would be public events in my brain. You could know more about my conscious life than I could if you were a brain scientist. But that's not true, because the brain scientist is going to rely upon me reporting to him what's going on inside of me while he's measuring my brain. Otherwise, he wouldn't know that I was having a dream, because he doesn't have access to my conscious life. So that would be my quick definition of consciousness.
Well, thank you so much, because working in a ER, I can tell you that I saw lots of people with a lot of fake
Yeah,
propositions.
I'll bet you did.
Um, the property dualist argues that the mental states are irreducible attributes of brain states. For the property dualist, mental phenomena are non-physical property of physical substance.
Yes.
Dualists commonly argue that for the distinction of mind and matter, by employing Leibniz's law of identity, according to which two things are identical F and only F, they are simultaneously share precisely the same quality. Could you explain the philosophical objection to property dualism?
Well, yes. So suppose we have some property A. Let's just say it's my wife's favorite color. And suppose we have another property B, the color of the sky. Now, we're wondering, are those two different properties, or are they just two ways of referring to the very same property, and there's only one property, so that property A is the same thing as property B? Well, suppose it turns out that my wife's favorite color is blue and the color of the sky is blue. Then we have one property, two ways of talking about it, but they're not two different properties. And so we say that by what's called the law of identity. If A is identical to B, they're not two things that are the same, then everything true of A, if A is 5'7", then B better be 5'7". And if you can find one thing true of one, or even possibly true of one that's not true of the other, they can't be the same thing. So now the problem is that the properties of conscious states are different from the properties of brain states. For example, while I'm suppose I'm having an experience of seeing a red apple, that conscious state has the property of, there is a what it's like to see red, and that's different than what it's like to see yellow. And so it has its own unique what it's like. But the brain state that's going on has no what it's like to it at all. It can be completely described in the language of chemistry and physics. My mental state is of or about something. In this case, the surface of that apple. My brain state isn't of or about anything. I have private access to my conscious experience of the apple, but I don't have private access to my brain. So consciousness can't be the same thing as the brain, because they have different attributes. Now, the question is, are those conscious properties that are not physical, what do they belong to? Do they belong to the brain, so that the physical properties of my neurons firing and the property of having a sensation of the red object are both in my brain somehow? Or is the physical property in my brain, but the mental property is in my soul? Now, neuroscientists cannot answer that question. And here's why. Each of those theories is consistent with the same observations, so that when you observe the brain or behavior, everything a neuroscientist can measure and observe can be interpreted in two ways. Either that conscious state belongs to the brain, or the conscious state belongs to the soul or self or the mind. And there's no way a neuroscientist can tell the difference, because the empirical information is equally consistent with both options. So how do we settle this? Well, the answer is going to be philosophically and theologically. And so I've come to the conclusion that physical properties are in my brain, but my conscious properties belong to my soul, though while I'm in the body, if there is damage to some of my organs, like if my eyes are put out, I won't be able to see, even though it's my soul that sees, my eyes don't. And if my brain is damaged, I won't be able to recall memories or think very well, even though the memories and the thoughts are in my soul, not my brain. Now, how could that be? Well, God created us so that when we're in our bodies, we are dependent on our bodily organs to function for our souls to function well. Now, let me give you an example. Suppose that I was put into the driver's seat of a car, but my seatbelt was fastened and I was locked in the front seat so that I couldn't get out, and the doors were locked. So now I'm stuck in the driver's seat. Now I'm driving around town, but all of a sudden, something happens to the steering wheel and it can only turn right. All right. So I can't make a left turn. I can only turn right. Or eventually some damage occurs to the engine and I can only go 10 kilometers an hour. Now, what that doesn't prove that I am the car. It only shows that I'm the driver who has to use the car when I'm inside of it. So if the car is damaged, I am limited in what I can do, but I am not the car. Now, if I could get out of the car, then the broken car wouldn't make any difference to me. I could walk around town on my own. Well, when the soul is in the body, if the brain or other organs are damaged, that limits what I can do, because while I'm in the body, I use the body like the car, but that doesn't prove I'm my brain or my organs. And in fact, when people die, they actually are able to see things and they don't have any brain at all. So that would be my illustration.
That's very interesting, because that would be another subject, talking about the near-death experience, which I will have a lot of questions about, especially being in my field and seeing, I'm not saying privileged, but I've been seeing, experience quite a bit. Interesting.
That is a privilege.
A phenomena, to listen to the last beat of a heart.
Yes.
It's quite interesting, but that will be for another interview.
All right.
There are three main forms of a substance dualism, and we're talking about the Cartesian dualism, Thomistic substance dualism, and emergent dualism. All three propositions, though, hold the common that self or ego, it's an immaterial substance that bears consciousness.
That's right.
Would you explain what is the case for substance dualism and the immaterial nature of the self?
Well, that's a very good question. So now let's remember, the property dualist says consciousness is non-physical. The substance dualist says not only is consciousness non-physical, but the thing that has it, the self or the soul, is also non-physical. So you have non-physical properties of consciousness, and the possessor is a non-physical thing. And here's some reasons why we believe that. First one is that a physical object like a brain or a table can have 80% of it lost and cut off, and then you'd have 80% of a table left. That actually happens in brain surgery. There are cases where about 55% of the brain is cut out and removed. Now, when the person wakes up, you don't have 45% of a person left. You have a whole person. Persons aren't divisible. It doesn't make any sense to say, look over there, there's 80% of a person. What does make sense is there's a whole person, but they've lost 20% of their functioning because of something happened to them. There's a disease called Dandy Walker's syndrome, and there are pictures on the internet where these people only have 10% of a brain. There's a thin centimeter wide inside the skull brain tissue, and the entire inside of that the head cavity is a sac of fluid. These aren't 10% of persons, though. They're full persons, and in fact, they function about 75 or 80% of normal people. So that's number one. I'm not divisible, and I can't exist as a percentage of my original self, but physical objects like tables and brains or bodies can. and therefore I can't be a physical object. Another one is this. I have free will. I am responsible for my choices because sometimes they're up to me. And if I choose to do something, I could have refrained and not done it. That's why I'm responsible. If I were determined by my genetics and my brain to act, well, then it wasn't my choice and nobody would hold me responsible for it. Well, my brain and body don't have free will. Everything your brain and body does, unless you act freely, is governed by the laws of chemistry and physics. So if I were my brain and body, my entire behavior would be determined by the laws of chemistry and physics, and I could not act freely. Therefore, I would not be responsible for my actions any more than I am if I have a nervous twitch because I have a disease and my hand twitches. Or I'm not responsible for my eye color. But you and I we both know that sometimes we act freely, and maybe a lot of times, and that means there's got to be something about us that rises above the physical, and the best thing that could be would be a soul. Now let me give you one other example, another argument. If we had a podium here that I was lecturing on, and it was made out of wood. But every day somebody took a little part off of it and replaced it with a plastic part. Over the days, this podium gets completely replaced. And now what's in front of me is a plastic podium without any metal parts to it. Or wood, what did I say, wooden?
Wood.
Without any wooden parts. Would it be the same podium? Well, the answer is obviously no. In fact, once one part was gone, it wouldn't be the same podium in the strict sense as an entire podium, because if a physical object gains and loses parts, it's not strictly the same physical object. Now, I am the same from one moment to another. When I hum a tune, Octavian, it's obvious to me that the same self that finishes humming the tune is the self that began humming the tune. And I am the same self that's lecturing now with you that began this time. Well, my body is not strictly the same because cells are constant. My brain is losing cells and atoms and molecules, but I am. So I can be the same even though my body gains and loses parts. So I can't be my body and brain. I've got to be something that doesn't lose parts. I must be a simple soul. So those are some arguments for the soul. But the thing that's most important is that the case for whether or not there's a soul cannot be addressed by neuroscience. It's outside the boundaries of what neuroscientific methods are capable of addressing. They can't even address this question. And the solution will turn to be a theological or philosophical one.
Talking about the soul, you wrote that the soul is a very complicated thing with an intricate structure. You talk about the different states of consciousness that take place within the soul.
Yes.
Would you talk about the 5 different states contained in the soul?
Yes. Let's just say water can exist in 3 states: solid, liquid, or gas. An electron can exist in 2 states. It can be spinning clockwise or spinning counterclockwise. So a state is just a way something has been modified. It can be, water can be modified as a solid or as a liquid or as a gas. All these states belong to the water. Now, our soul can be modified in the same way. That means that myself or my soul can have 5 different kinds of states, not 3 like water. So just like it can be in a solid, liquid, or gas state, I can be in a sensory state. I can be in a thinking state. I can be in a believing state. I can be in a desiring state, or I can be in a choosing state where I'm acting freely and choosing something at that moment. So the sensory state is a pure experience of awareness of something, like I'm seeing a yellow object or tasting a lemon, or feeling pain. A thought is, like I said before, is when I'm having a mental content that I could use language to express, and it can be true or false. A belief is that same mental content, only it is something that I take to be true to some degree of certainty. I may be wrong, but at least I think it's true. Whereas the thought, I might not necessarily think it's true. I'm just having the thought. A desire is a felt pull towards something or away from something. I have a desire to avoid the dentist, but I have a desire for dessert. And then an active choice is just when I exercise my power to raise my hand to vote, let's say. And those are all states of consciousness, but they all occur within the same thing, namely the soul. Just like if I had a little glass of water, the solid, liquid, and gas states would all occur to the same thing, namely that little glass of water. So that would be, our states of consciousness change constantly as we go through our day, but we're the same self that has those states of consciousness.
We've been talking about the human soul, bringing only the not only the philosophical concept, but also the biblical aspect of the soul, of the soul existence. And interesting, we find two interesting Hebrew terms in the Old Testament. Hayach, that translates life, and nefesh also translate as life. But the combination of the two words, hayaf, nefesh, translates soul. It also appears that the same terms are used for humans and animals as having souls. So here's the question that my son is hardly waiting to hear you. Do we have any evidence that animals have a soul?
Absolutely, they do. And there's no question about this. In fact, the Bible teaches it. Like you just pointed out, the term soul is used of animals. And the church fathers and everyone up until the 16th century believed that animals had souls. In fact, there were very detailed theories that Augustine and others developed about the difference between the human soul and the animal soul. So let me give you, when I say an animal has a soul, I mean that there is something in the animal that contains its conscious life and animates its body so it is a living body. It's not a corpse. That's all I mean. Now, there are differences. Animals have different kinds of souls. For example, I think a frog's soul is capable of having experiences of sensations. They're able to be aware of objects in their environment. But I don't believe there's any evidence that a frog is capable of thinking. So it has a very simple soul. Now, a dog has a more complicated soul. How do I know? Because its behavior is more complex and it indicates the soul is more. So for example, dogs clearly have a soul that is capable of having the property of pain. Dogs experience pain. And remember, experiences are not characteristics of matter. They're characteristics of a soul. But dogs also think. They're capable of thinking that my food is in the kitchen or something like that. But only the human soul is made in the image of God. It is far more complicated than an animal soul. For example, an animal soul can think, but it can't think about its thinking. Like I can think about my thinking. I might say to myself, you know what, I'm thinking too much about negative things. I'm not thinking enough about positive things. Well, that's a thought about my thoughts. Or I could say, I wonder what percentage of my thoughts are true and what percentage are false. Well, I have beliefs about my beliefs. I believe that my beliefs are reasonable. I have an awareness of my awarenesses. For example, I'm having pain, but I might stop focusing on other things and draw my attention so that I'm only aware of that pain that I'm experiencing, and so on. But animals don't have thoughts about their thoughts. They don't have beliefs about their beliefs. We never see an animal giving evidence that it's thinking about repenting, which means that it's having thoughts about its own thinking and wants to change its thinking. Dogs don't make New Year's resolutions. So the other thing is that we have in our souls a little compartment called the spirit. And the spirit is a component of the soul. You might think of it as a little component that has the powers of being aware of God's presence, being aware of supernatural beings, like I've been aware of demons and angels before. It is kind of, when it combines with the mind, it is able to receive the word of God, where the mind is what understands the word, but the spirit in the soul is what is able to receive and embrace it and apply it. We get spiritual insight into the word, but the mind is what interprets the word. And so animals don't have free will. Humans do. Animals don't have a moral conscience. People might think they do, but they really don't. I can't tell you why. So animals do have souls. Do they survive the death of their bodies? That depends on whether God chooses to sustain them, just like me. If God didn't sustain me after I died, I'd be out of here. I continue only because God wants to sustain me in existence in the afterlife. Does he sustain animals? I'm maybe 60% yes, 40% no, because a lot of people who have had near-death experiences claim to have seen animals in heaven. And here's what I'll say, Octavian. If we need animals to be in heaven, to be fully happy there, God's going to have animals there. And if we don't, he probably won't.
Thank you for that question, because my son was asking me, are we going to see Barney in heaven? That's what you're telling me, Dad, if the soul has. I said, I do not know. I'm going to ask, somebody who's smarter than me. And I'm not sure if he's got to give you a full understanding of what answer, but God will know better, his
Right.
will. If
Right. I think it's maybe 60% likely he will, 40% he won't. So I'm a little over 50-50, but like you can just tell him, look, if you need Barney to be there for you to experience all the joy God wants you to in heaven, don't worry about it, dude. He'll be there.
I think my wife will need that more than my son.
I'm not going to get in the middle of a family fight, so I'll stay out of that one.
I want to ask you another question, because you're talking about the neuroscience and the fact that, they cannot prove it. They didn't prove anything so far. I'm a doctor, nurse practice, and everything that I do is based on scientific data. We diagnose, treat patient on the latest scientific evidence in treating diseases. Does neuroscience, and I was asked by one of our students last week or so, does neuroscience has anything even closer to kind of saying that there is a possibility of the existence of a soul?
Well, I think so, and here's what I would think. Number one, when you're doing a chemistry experiment, it's just out there in the laboratory, and everything in the beakers and that you're combining and mixing are all publicly accessible. We can all know what it is because they're publicly available objects, if that makes sense to you. Now, when neuroscientists are doing experiments and they've got EEGs on the brain, or they're trying to measure oxygen flow and electrical activity in the brain, when they see electrical activity occurring in a region of the brain, they have to ask the person, would you tell us what's going on in your mind right now? And so when they do that, they correlate, I'm dreaming of falling off a cliff, with this brain activity. All right. Now, my question, like when they measured rapid eye movement when people were asleep, They could do that by looking at the eyes moving, but then they didn't know what that meant. So they had to wake the person up and say, is anything going on? And he said, oh yeah, I was dreaming just now. Well, why did they have to wake the patient up and ask for these reports? Because they don't have access to consciousness. It's private. They only have access to the brain. And so apart from the other sciences like chemistry and physics, where you don't have to ask anybody anything, if you're going to know what's going on inside the person while the brain's firing, there's no other way to tell than asking them. And so that is a dualist implication, because we believe that consciousness is not available to public inspection. But I would say that the fact that we can have a unity to our consciousness, and it can be one single stream of consciousness, even though we lose large chunks of our brain, makes no sense if I'm my brain. But it does make sense if I am a partless spirit soul that uses the brain. So those would be some things I think should be convincing to neuroscientists. And I do believe that most neuroscientists think that we have free choice because they ask us questions and they trust that we are choosing to tell them the truth. They don't know that instead of faking it. So neuroscientific methodology presupposes that patients are freely choosing to tell them what's really true instead of choosing to hide and not tell them the truth. If you didn't have that assumption, Octavian, neuroscience couldn't even get going. But that means that they're attributing to these patients choice because they can choose to tell the truth or not. Your brain doesn't have free choice, okay? So they're by using free choice to ask patients questions, they're attributing to us something that the brain does not possess, and that means I'm not my brain.
Well, thank you so much for all these questions and all this this answer to the questions. But I want to change because we're going toward the end, and in your book you talk about something very important to me, and and to many other people. One of the interesting data that I saw is that the Pew Research Center in 2014 found that nearly 60% of Americans surveyed believe in hell. Actually, it was 59, but nearly 60, out of which 44% of the men and 56% of the women do not believe in hell. There is any reason to believe in hell? Can you explain what biblical representation of hell is? I find it fascinating not to believe in hell. And you write in your book about hell, so I said I have to ask you about it.
Well, yes, it would be immoral for there not to be a hell. Now, let me explain why. We Christians are against what's called physician-assisted suicide. We believe that passive euthanasia, that means letting a patient die, is morally permissible if the patient is terminally ill and further treatment won't help. In that case, you can passively let the patient die, but you can't kill them because it's wrong to kill someone, but you can let them die. Now, God creates us in his image, and we get our value not from the quality of our life, but from the simple fact that we exist as his image bearers. I mean, I teach at a university, and during finals week, I can tell you the quality of the students' lives is not very high. Now, we don't get our value from the quality of our life. If we did, then we wouldn't all be equally valuable, because some of us we're not real happy people and other people are. The only way we could have equal value is if our value is based on something we all share in common, namely the image of God. Now, what that means is that if God creates people and they will not respond, they don't want to be around God, they reject the kind of person he is. Have you ever been around somebody that's really smart and attractive and they get all the attention, you get none? Well, how would you like to be stuck with that person forever? I mean, so people don't want to be around that kind of a being. So God is, you might say, he's kind of on the horns of a dilemma, figuratively speaking. He can't snuff them out of existence. Why? Because that would be to destroy creatures that have inherent value. Why would we think God would be justified in snuffing people out of their existence if they go to hell? Well, they're not very happy. I mean, it's not a good state of life. But you see, that assumes that they get their value from the quality of their life, not from their just existing in God's image. So God will not extinguish a creature made in his image because he doesn't believe their value is due to their quality of life. So if they're not willing to come to him, and they have a free will, and God won't extinguish them, his only solution is to quarantine them. And hell is a quarantine where people are. I don't believe it's a torture chamber. I believe the suffering in hell is from knowing that you rejected all the goodness and the source of goodness and beauty and happiness that existed. Now you're stuck with your own choices, and I wouldn't want to be there. So God has created hell because he will not destroy his image bearers, but he acknowledges the risk of giving them free choice, which means that they can say no to him. And if they do, then God will respect their choices, but he'll cast them away from him into a realm of existence that is for those who would not repent and would never say yes, and he won't annihilate them. So that's why I believe hell is real. I think it's the only moral thing that could solve this problem of people in his image who say no. By the way, I think Bill Craig once said that he thinks, listen to me carefully now, he says it may be that people in hell are still free to leave, but no one will. So there's not going to be anybody that's going to leave hell, even though they could. And the reason they won't is the longer they're in there, the more they hate God and they become self-absorbed. So, it's not unbiblical to say, well, when people are in hell, they could choose to get out if they wanted to, but they never will want to. So nobody will ever leave hell, even though they've made it possible. That's an idea I'm thinking about. Maybe I don't know.
It's a very interesting idea, though. I mean,
yeah, it's very interesting.
Since we talk about hell, so and we are at the end of it, let's talk about the other better part, where at the end of life, where the soul is going. Where are we going?
Well, yes, I just finished a book called A Simple Guide to Miracles, where I list 5 different kinds of miracles that are happening all over the world today. And one of those are near-death experiences. And I will tell you that there are 300 million of these that have happened in the world, according to statistical studies. And these have been very carefully researched. A lot of Christians think they're not consistent with the Bible, but it turns out they actually are far more consistent than people know, although some of them are kooky. I agree with that. But the majority of them, I think, are actually real. And a lot of the people go to hell and come back. And so when you go to heaven, people don't ever want to return, because this world, by comparison, is just extremely dull and uninteresting. And it's an experience that they claim is filled with the peace and joy and overwhelming love from the Lord Jesus when they meet him. So it's going to be something to really look forward to, and it's real.
Thank God for that, and it's an assurance that we have. Dr. Moreland, thank you so much for giving us a hand in understanding some basic biblical teaching about the existence of the soul, the presence of hell, and the better part of the eternity that some of us believe in it.
Yep.
It has been a privilege, hoping that we can repeat a youth conference in Romania soon, or as your schedule will permit. God bless you. God bless your family and the service that you have been invested in for our Lord and Savior. Thank you so much. May God bless you.
It has been my privilege. Thank you.